That's brilliant, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Planning Committee. I'm Councillor Karen McCarthy. I'm the Chair of the Planning Committee, and for this morning, once again, I am a disembodied voice. You can see the rest of the committee, but I'm actually sitting below the camera at the front. Hopefully, they'll let me be shown on camera again soon. But for this morning, that's where we are. This is a quasi-judicial meeting and no decisions are made in advance of the meeting. We meet not as ward councillors for our own wards, but as representatives of the whole City Council. And if I can just remind members that parliamentary privilege does not apply to our meetings. So even if you really hate something, you have to stay the right side of the law in expressing your concerns. So over to the agenda. And as I mentioned last time, we are changing over to a new webcast system. This meeting will be webcast for live and or subsequent broadcast by the Council's YouTube meetings site. It's a very long reference, which is included in the agenda item. I'm not going to attempt to read it out because nobody's going to write it down and then input it. But if you go to YouTube and look for Birmingham City Council, it should take you to that particular webcast. Members of the press and public may record and take photographs except where there are or exempt items, of which I don't expect to have any today. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Members are reminded that they must declare all relevant pecuniary and non-pecuniary interests arising from any business to be discussed at this meeting. If a disclosable pecuniary interest is declared, a member must not speak or take part in that agenda item, and any declarations will be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. That's the standard item for all Birmingham City Council meetings. In addition, for Planning Committee, you may hear and see members declare that they've expressed a view previously on an application and are therefore excusing themselves from a particular item. Item 3 is apologies. We have apologies from Councillors Beecham, Mia, Scott and Mike Ward. Chair's announcements, I've already covered the changes to the webcast, so the only announcements I've got today are the dates of the future meetings. So we'll be back on the 22nd of July, the 5th and the 19th of August. And we move on to the minutes which members have received. Can we agree the minutes of the 24th of June? Agree. Thank you. So we're now on to planning applications, which I normally say at this point we take by geographical area, but today we've only got applications from the northwest. We have 2 applications. We were expecting to have a speaker on item 6, so I'm just going to ask officers whether there's any sign of the speaker. I'm going to take item 7 first, if that's okay, just to give the potential speaker a few extra minutes to get here. So I'll take item 7 and then we'll come back to item 6. I think that's fair. I won't be able to delay it beyond that point. So item 7 is land at 6 Farmcote Drive and to the rear of 38 and 40 Walsall Road in Sutton Coldfield. And I'll start by asking Pete whether there are any updates on this item.
I can have updates on this item.
Okay, we don't have speakers on item 7. So do I have any members wishing to ask questions or comment? Councillor Cornish.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, Farmcote Drive is an extremely narrow road that I have visited on numerous occasions. One of the big problems we have there is vehicles that can't park on a very, very busy water road use farm drive constantly, creates huge problems for existing residents by blocking them in. They cannot get out their own drives 9 times out of 10. Yes, these are family homes which we need. However, this is like most things, and actually I should say it's an improvement on the previous application, but back-end developments such as this creates huge problems and really is over-intensive for the site. So I feel that, as far as I'm concerned, it's unacceptable and I cannot support. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Moore, did you have your hand up? Okay. Does anyone else wish to speak on this one? I'm not seeing anyone. I'll go back to Pete and then to Paul Cowan, who's our transportation officer, and then if anybody else has got any questions or comments, we can come back to that. Pete, would you like to answer that point?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor. There is some planning history to this application. I think we need to identify that it's a proposal for a small cul-de-sac of an existing cul-de-sac in an area where there are quite a number of other cul-de-sacs, and so there's no objection in principle to cul-de-sac development in this location. In fact, it's something which the Planning Inspectorate on a planning appeal many years ago identified. The issue has always been with this, with previous schemes, and how it's been designed and how it responds to the character of the area. As Councillor Cornish was discussing, the previous scheme, there was a previous refusal. This was 4 houses. The fundamental changes between this scheme and the previous scheme is that there was an additional house being proposed on the access onto Farm Court Drive, and which resulted in a very narrow access, which was deemed to be out of character. In terms of the 3 houses to the rear of the site at the end of the cul-de-sac, that's now been designed so there's better enclosure. So really, officers feel it's good design, it's good placemaking. Fundamentally, it's a far superior scheme to previous schemes we've seen on the site. In terms of parking and access, it's been looked at by our transportation colleagues. The parking provision within the site meets the maximum standards, which is 200, so two parking spaces per dwelling. But there is actually some capacity, arguably, within the development away from Farm Court Drive, which would actually impact on the actual existing vehicle movement on Farm Court Drive. Chair.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, certainly the development proposal in front of you today has sufficient parking and access requirements to accommodate not only the residents and visitor parking on the development, but it's also been demonstrated that a fire engine can also turn within the turning space within that development, and also a bin store is located within proximity to Farm Court Drive itself. Noting also the comments of that planning inspector back in 2005. At that time, for a larger development, the inspector didn't feel that there was any significant impact on Farm Court Drive. If there is, since that point, an issue with on-street parking obstructing particular accesses that exist at the moment, that would be a separate matter to be investigated. But certainly the development here with the conditions that are attached or recommended would not in itself signify any material reason to resist. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak on this one, or are you ready to move to the vote? Seeing no one contrary, so I will move to the vote. Can I see those in favour of the application? And those against? I make that 7 in favour and 3 against, so that is approved. I'm still not seeing anybody else in the room, but I can't delay item 6 any further, even though our speaker hasn't arrived. We move to item 6, which is 109 Grove Lane, Handsworth. Pete, do we have any updates on this one?
We have no updates. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. In that case, do members want to contribute on this one? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. 6.2 of the report references the Birmingham Development Plan and mentions that there's no policy directly relating to HMO use, but also states in there about being able to create a sustainable, mixed and balanced community. And I feel that residents have suggested in this report that HMOs in this particular community, that there's quite a lot of them, but our figures unfortunately suggest differently. I do have a concern that this proposal of 7 bedrooms on 2 floors, that the ground floor has been taken by retail space and storage in a bedroom, a bathroom. The concern that I have is the living space for 7 bedrooms on those 2 floors. But I do appreciate there's the park opposite that's been mentioned in the report. When you have cold winter months, that doesn't become an option, and it's quite a condensed amount of space for 7 people. I think the retail space would have been better used as a larger living space, personally. But I do have a concern about the small living area for 7 people that will be living in that particular property. But given that the park is there, I can't see anything that I can say to refuse this application, but it is a concern with that number of people in that particular. Thank you.
I'll take a couple more people if people want to speak. Councillor Suleiman.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to check whether the on 4.11 the West Midlands Police recommendations, whether they'll be adopted fully.
Thank you. I'll take Councillor Moore and then ask Pete to respond to all 3.
Thank you, Chair. I echo some of the concerns that Councillor Johnson has raised with this application, particularly in terms of the amenity space that's been offered for future occupiers. I'm also slightly concerned because if I've understood the plan correctly, it would appear that the entrance to this HMO would be through the bin store of the retail unit as well, which doesn't strike me as a particularly welcoming environment if that's the case. Now, obviously, there are a number of objections to this and various groups in Handsworth, particularly around the concentration of HMOs within Handsworth, which I don't think anyone can really dispute. I mean, there's been a number of applications that have come before us, which sadly have been approved. So I think it's quite clear that Handsworth does suffer from an over concentration of HMOs and other types of accommodation. I'm particularly interested in that, we seem to dismiss the concerns raised by these objectors at 6.10. And particularly in terms of, because I imagine some of the properties are referring to the exempt accommodation and other forms, which, to the general public, they consider a HMO, which actually technically is not. But these are all factors which add to the challenges within these parts of Birmingham, the over concentration, the antisocial behaviour that unfortunately accompanies some of this accommodation. So I'm just rather concerned that we've been far too dismissive, and I think we need to look further to actually understand what it is that's taking place within the area, rather than just simply say, no, there's no planning history of it, because actually some of it, particularly prior to the Article 4, didn't need planning permission. So I think we need to look at this further before we simply say there's no HMOs in the area and therefore this should be acceptable.
I'll take answers to those 3 points and then go around again. Pete.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, councillors. Starting with the first point in relation to the accommodation over the 3 floors. So you can see within the report itself, there is a copy of the layout of the individual floors, and there's also a photograph showing the communal space, which shows the kitchen and also sort of general socialising space as well. It also shows the rear door, which leads onto a rear yard, which has been cleared of. I believe there was an outbuilding there, which has been cleared. officers do consider that there is sufficient or adequate space for the individuals, their own personal space in terms of their bedroom, but also the communal space for a maximum of 7 residents. And you will see in the officers' report that there's a condition limiting it to a maximum of 7 residents at any one time. It's a very valid point about the park. Yes, the park is immediately opposite. There are no actual standards in terms of how much outdoor amenity space should be given, for example, per resident. There isn't actually a standard, so it's very much a judgment. Officers do feel that 40 square metres, which is the rear yard here, is sufficient for the 7 residents. It's an existing situation. In fact, it's been improved in terms of the outbuilding being removed. The park is a very large park. Handsworth Park is a very large park. People do use parks at all times of the year. You know, it's not that parks close up during the winter. People do use, but it is a valid point that you're more likely to use the park during better weather. But there is a park there, which is open to publicly accessible, and because of the size of the park, there are lots of additional things you can do within the park which you wouldn't be able to do in, say, for example, a smaller park. So it is a good location in that context. The comment about the police's recommendations about CCTV and locks on the doors, officers feel that falls outside the remit of planning and doesn't meet the 6 relevant tests set out in legislation. But those details have been passed over to the applicant. Officers always do that where information is provided by, for example, West Midlands Police, which falls outside our remit. We will still pass those details on, so the applicant is aware of that. Finally, just touching on the point Councillor Moore raised about what really comes down to it's a very valid issue to do with the cumulative impact within an identified area. We do have a draft policy within the Development Management in Birmingham document, which is in an advanced stage, so we do feel it's absolutely legitimate and suitably has suitable weight behind it that we can use it. We have carried that out. We have used the evidence which is identified in the draft. It's called the DMB document, the Development Management in Birmingham document. I think it's fair to say that we need to use a sound evidence base, and officers have looked at the variety of data available, and we have come to the conclusion that in terms of existing HMOs, which are identified by council, with this proposal, it would be 2% within 100 metres of the application site, and that's including the application premises. And that represents 3 out of 94 properties. There are other intensive residential uses in the area. These are more historical, identified flat conversions on the opposite side on Douglas Road, as well as a lodging house, a long-established lodging house, also on Douglas Road. But it's fair to say that officers need to draw a line in the sand in terms of what data can be used in terms of looking at cumulative impact, and officers feel that we've done that. And for the reasons identified in the report, officers do not feel there's grounds for refusal on the issue of too many HMOs or cumulative impact of HMOs and similar uses in the locality. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll take Councillor Straker-Wells and anybody else with a point to make. I know Sean wants to come in, but let's mop up the rest of the member contributions first. Councillor Straker-Wells.
I really find that Councillor Moore's point about the nature of the context of the situation that this particular application is in. And also the calculation that's made about the percentage of HMOs. My assumption is that unless the HMOs are actually registered, we don't know the number of HMOs that are affected. I'm also aware that it's not a planning issue to consider how the HMOs are going to be used and what the clientele are going to be in there. Although that would be a question in my mind, given the nature of the application, where it's situated and how it looks. I have to say, and this is just a subjective judgment, it makes me feel extremely queasy. But the key thing is really about how you actually calculate the number, the density of bitumen. And that's the reason why it's, in a sense, it's a shame the speaker isn't here, because I'd like to hear the speaker's position. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, I appreciate what you said about the park. It's a large park. I do understand that. But I just want to just make the comment that I think when you look at the proposed ground floor plan, the retail element of that plan, the size of that, in comparison to the amenity area, that the shop's going to be bigger than the shared accommodation. And I just think that looks completely out of proportion. I think you're going to have 7 people living in that. If that retail unit wasn't there, I'd feel much happier about this proposal, much happier. But forget the park across the road. We've got a decent amount of shared living space for 7 residents. And
Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question really. I'm looking at the ground floor plans. The floor plans. Focusing on the second/attic floor plan. I'm just wondering that I assume, given that the attic level, that those bedrooms on that floor will be impacted by sloping roofs. I wonder if any consideration is given to how that affects the kind of usable space within those bedrooms.
Okay, I think we'll go back to Pete for the very specific answers on those questions, and then I'll bring Sean in.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Councillor Johnson, yeah, again, very valid point about the shop. Ultimately, we have to determine what's put in front of us, and as already stressed, officers do feel that there is an acceptable level of community space for the 7 occupants. On the issue of the attic room, it's very interesting on this because they have actually lowered the floor level of the attic room. So the ceiling height of the first floor has come down. And there is some commentary in the report about sort of the impact on the windows, and that the windows need to be reinstated, and there's a condition to reflect that. But yes, I have actually seen pictures inside as well, and we have taken into consideration sort of floor to ceiling height, and because of the changes to the floor level to the top floor being brought down, it is a fair reflection of the space that will be available to the residents. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll hand over to Sean. Could you pick up specifically, Sean, please, Councillor Moore's point about whether there's more information?
Yes,
great. Thank you.
Yeah, it was really just to pick up some of the points that have been sort of missed or needed a little bit more clarification. In terms of that last point, it's worth remembering, obviously, in older properties, ceiling heights are much higher, so there is a bit of scope to sort of tweak. The CCTV point, I just wanted to clarify that what the police are asking for, and the reason we're saying it's not a planning matter, is it's about CCTV and locked doors within the building, and we're saying that what goes on within the building is really a management issue rather than external CCTV about public safety. So that's why we're saying in this case it's not relevant. There was a point Councillor Moore made about access through the bin store, and looking at I can see the point he's making, but look at the ground floor layout. You've got an access from the rear into the gardeners, we can call it, and then there's a rear access which is into the flats. So I don't think it's necessarily dependent on coming through that area. Now, I don't think that area is necessarily a bin store. It's not clear what it is. You've got the retail shop, then outside the building you've got bins for the shop. So it looks to me as though the bins for the shop are being stored outside, Then there's an ante room that's got roof lights, and it's not clear what that's for. And then off there, you've got stairs and a storage room. So it's not clear that room is actually a bin store. It looks like it's just an ante room, and I'm not clear from the plans what that is. If Pete knows, then he can come back and clarify. But there's a front door by the bins, but there's also a rear door which could be used. In terms of the evidence around HMOs, and I think what you've heard is that we have information available for you. That's in the report. And I don't think a deferral is going to produce any more evidence. So it's basically determining on the evidence you have available. And we are talking of a relatively low level of HMOs within that 100 metres radius. So it's 3%, I think was the figure. So it's not just tipping on the balance, it's quite a way below it. In terms of the amenity space, the only points I wanted to make two is, one is we are seeing inspectors where we're concerned that amenity space is too small and it's near to a park or near to open space. Planning inspectors are giving that credence. But just in the same way that you may not want to go to a park in bad weather, you may not want to go into your garden in bad weather either. So what we can see, I think, in that photograph is there is a reasonable space to allow for drying of clothes, sitting out, or the usual activities associated with a residential use, and we think that's enough. And the park does, if you like, make a difference. In terms of that balance between the retail use and the residential use, we're not saying it couldn't be better, but the issue in front of you is it good enough? And our recommendation is that yes, it is. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to come back in? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Just on another issue that's been raised is the flood risk. Is there an existing flood risk, and would the change of use impact on flood risk and existing flood risk?
Okay, I'm sure Pete's got that at his fingertips.
It's not within a flood risk area, so there are no concerns from a planning perspective in terms of change of use. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, any other comments or questions before we move to the vote? Councillor Moore did suggest there might be more information that we needed, but you've heard the response to that. Okay, I'm going to take the vote then. Those in favour? And those against? And that is 7 in favour and 3 against, so that is approved. And as you've heard from Pete, there is work going on about how we calculate levels of HMOs of all types, and you'll also be aware of the work being done on exempt accommodation across the city. But on the day, we need to decide on what's available to us. Thank you for that. That's the end of this morning's applications, but we do have a policy report, which is on the revisions to the scheme of delegation. You'll remember we made some changes last year and we need to look at where we go now. So I'll hand over to Sean to introduce this item.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, you recall we made some changes in May 2020. That was partially because of the peer review, which said we needed to do that and we needed to look at modernising the committee. And it was also partially to do with the fact that we'd moved from physical to virtual committees, and it was to enable that to be handled a little bit more easily to reduce the number of applications coming to committee. We had around about 22 virtual committees, but we've now ended that and we're back into physical committees. So I thought it was time to review where we've been and where we are. So what's in front of you is the scheme of delegation as approved in May 20. During the past year that I've been working with you, I've also reflected on some of the items that you've been dealing with, and I think that just from a historical point of view, there is some things that you always get that really are fairly minor. So I have made some further tweaks to take those out, or to suggest taking those out. And I think the easiest thing to do is to go through the proposed changes in Appendix 1. So I can find Appendix 1. So the new wording, additional wording is in bold, and any deletions are being struck through. So the first one is in 9A, which is about call-in applications. And we, what I've done there is put a note just to clarify that call-in shouldn't apply to applications for lawful development certificates. So proposed lawful development, existing lawful development, or uses, because they involve a legal determination based on the evidence rather than a balance or a matter of opinion. And so because of that, at the moment, they sometimes are called to committee, but essentially your hands are tied with dealing with evidence rather than expressing opinion. So what I've suggested is that we clarify that and say they should remain as delegated items. If, as I'm going through, any of you want to speak or ask me about those particular issues, please stop me, because I think that might be easier than me going through to the end and then we deal with it all. So please indicate if you want to comment or add questions on each point. The next one is at item C. Now, item C is where it's the applicant is either a member of the council or an officer in the planning service. So I've made a slight amendment to the wording just to make it clearer by deleting a couple of words, but that doesn't change the sense of the clause. But I have added a note to clarify that this does not include applications where the applicant is a relative or of an officer or member, but no member or officer has an interest in the land itself. And it's, the clarification is because on an application form, you're asked to declare, are you a relative or are you an officer or member? But just because you are, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a committee item. So if it's a relative, there's no legal interest in the land, I'm saying that should be treated as just a normal application. E is the next change. Now, E and I, the old I, which is below, both deal with departure applications. So we have two clauses dealing with the same issue. So what I've done there is just conflated them and dealt with it in one clause. So there is no change, it is just putting them together in one clause. So it remains the same that where it's a significant breach of policy that we would normally refer to DCLG, it would be reported to committee. G is relating to major developments. Now this is a change. So at the moment we've got the criteria there, which we agreed previously, and what I'm suggesting is that criteria is specifically about applications we, as officers, are recommending to approve. But if it's a major application that's within that criteria where it's recommended for refusal, this amendment would allow officers to refuse and delegate it. Whereas at the moment, they have to come to committee whether they're approvals or refusals. Now, if obviously within these changes, there is still the scope that if it is a significant or a sensitive application, there is the fallback that the they can either be called in anyway, or that the officer can, the director can make that decision for it to be a committee item because of the sensitivities of the site. So that's always there as a parachute. Yes, Councillor Johnson.
Just in the side column, you've got amended to allow delegated review. So just at the very bottom of that, it says only a limited number of objections. When you say only a limited number, what sort of a number are we thinking there? Because previously on one of the paragraphs, you said substantial and given a figure of 20. So limited to me might be 1 or 2, but limited to somebody else might be 5 or 6. What sort of number are we talking when we say limited objections?
I think it's not, it's below 20.
Below 20.
Yeah.
Can we have that put in there?
Yeah. I mean, I chose the word limited rather than not substantial because I think sometimes, so 20 is the bar. So if it goes above that, it's a committee item. But sometimes if it's just below that in the teens, I think in this case we will probably bring it. But we could just use the phrase not substantial so that it's the same bar. That will make it simpler.
Yes, I think people would understand that what we're looking at numerically. Thank you.
The other big change to that particular clause is at the bottom where we talk about the exceptions. So at the moment, anything major comes to you, whether it's an outline, a permission, a refusal, a reserve matter, and what have you. So we've made that clarification at the top there about distinction between approval and refusals. The notation at the bottom, which is in bold, is to allow reserve matter applications to be dealt with on the delegated powers, where the layout is policy compliant, where there are no significant objections from consultees, and the number of third-party objections is not substantial. And I have used the word substantial there, so it is designed to be, if it's less than 20 objections. So that's to cover instances where we have a number of large outline sites that you've dealt with, that you've been to committee and you've approved, and there may be a number of reserve matter applications, or there might be one. And if it's straightforward, then really it doesn't need to come back to you. So this is to allow straightforward reserve matters to just be dealt with as a reserve matter. Clearly, if it's a sensitive or significant site where there's a history, then there's that provision that the office can just refer it anyway. So, for example, at the last committee, we dealt with a sensitive application. We dealt with 2 reserve matters. And I think sites like that would continue to be referred to committee. So it's the straightforward ones that this is aimed at.
And there would still be the option for members to call in.
Yes, absolutely.
These applications.
So I is deleted, but that's the one I referred to earlier. So L. Now L is one of these where you see every application where the council has a land interest. Well, what I'm suggesting here is that's not necessary. You've seen things like adverts on roundabouts, small-scale development, applications from BMHP where it involves council land. So this is allowing us to deal with council applications under delegated powers that are not major applications. There is also part of the reason for this is that in August there's some new regulations coming in which are to give a shorter time period for applications relating to public buildings. And these are aimed at things like schools and hospitals. Well, schools obviously are often council owned. So this would enable those public building applications that are owned by the council to be dealt with by delegated powers, if of course they are not controversial or they're not major, and they will be assessed amongst against the other criteria above, rather than just being referred simply because they're owned by the council. So that's that one. And M is around the issue of Section 106 agreements or unilateral undertakings, both of which are related to the additional controls that we often put in place with applications. So at the moment, we don't have the ability to resolve to do those as delegated items. So this is about adding in applications for up to 40 residential units. So those applications that would otherwise be delegated. So saying that if it's otherwise would have been delegated, and it's policy compliant or justified by viability assessment, then or it's a renewal or resubmission, then we can deal with those as delegated items and enter into Section 106 agreements. But again, there are the fallback clauses of call-ins and referral by the officer. And that is it in terms of the amendments. So I'm happy that the one we referred to earlier, changing the word on clause G to being not being significant number of objections rather than limited. And with that amendment, I recommend that you.
I think it was not substantial.
Yes,
it was that change.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you've used significant for statutory consultees and then
substantial. Yeah,
a substantial.
Yeah, I've written substantial, but I said significant. I'll get it right eventually.
Councillor Griffiths.
Just one point on that last one. It's supported by a viability assessment. Should that be an independent viability assessment? If the developer puts in loads of viability assessments, which are on the back of the fact.
The viability assessments these days, the way in which they're done is set out in the MPPF. And however good or bad the submission is, we have it assessed. So it's based on our assessment rather than what's submitted.
But you get an independent assessment.
Yes.
So can we amend the wording to make it clear that that's what we mean?
Yeah.
I wouldn't like to accept the developer's assessment without challenge.
Yeah, no, they always are.
Any other points? No? Are you happy then to agree these as our revised scheme of delegation? Yeah, I'm seeing none to the contrary. Okay, thank you very much. Right, the end of page 1. Page 2 starts with item 9, other urgent business. Anyone? Councillor Moore?
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered if there was any update in relation to the student accommodation supply and demand report.
I don't have an update at the moment. I'll chase it up for the next meeting. That then does take us to item 10, which is the motion that ends our meeting, that in an urgent situation between meetings, the chair, jointly with the relevant chief officer, has authority to act on behalf of the committee. Can we agree that? Thank you very much. Hopefully next time you might actually get to see me rather than me just be the voice of doom.
I'm quite happy to remain as the voice of doom.
Okay, you can be over there and be the voice of doom, but I would like to be on camera, if at all possible. Thank you all very much. That's it for this morning.